Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Dr. Elias Vaughn, and 17 months ago, I believed that the worst thing about working in institutional preservation was the dust. The endless, suffocating particulate matter that settled into every crease of clothing, every pore of skin, every corner of buildings that humanity had decided to forget. I was wrong. The worst thing about preservation work is discovering exactly why some places were meant to be forgotten. I had been working for the Historical Architecture Preservation Society for 9 years when I received the assignment that would fundamentally alter my understanding of physical space. My specialty was documentation, creating comprehensive architectural surveys of condemned institutional buildings before their inevitable demolition or conversion. Libraries, courthouses, hospitals, sanatoriums. Places where the accumulated weight of human bureaucracy had calcified into brick and mortar, only to be abandoned when funding evaporated or populations shifted or scandals made continuation untenable. The work paid adequately, though not well. My apartment in Providence was a third-floor walk-up with windows that faced a brick wall, and my car was a 15-year-old sedan with a passenger door that only opened from the inside. I lived alone, ate alone, worked alone. This isolation wasn't circumstantial, it was cultivated. After my divorce 3 years prior, I discovered that solitude possessed a certain purity that relationships lacked. Buildings didn't disappoint. Stone and wood and steel maintained their integrity in ways that people never could. The Crestfall archive came to my attention through a forwarded email from my supervisor, Margaret Chen. The subject line read simply, "Urgent State Archive Facility Full Survey Required." The body of the email contained an address in northwestern Massachusetts, a deadline of 6 weeks, and a fee that was 40% higher than my usual rate. No explanation for the urgency. No context for the increased compensation. Just coordinates and expectations. I should have questioned the lack of information. In 9 years of institutional documentation, I'd never encountered a project briefing so sparse. But the fee was substantial enough to cover 3 months of expenses, and I'd learned not to interrogate good fortune too closely. Desperation has a way of dulling skepticism. I spent 2 days researching the Crestfall archive before making the drive. The information available was surprisingly limited for a state-operated facility. I found the original construction permit from 1962, documenting the building as a secure document storage facility, commissioned by the Massachusetts State Archives Division. The architect was listed as Herman Walcott, whose name appeared on several other institutional projects from the same era, mostly government buildings with that characteristic post-war brutalism, all concrete angles and narrow windows. What struck me as unusual was the absence of any subsequent records, no renovation permits, no maintenance complaints, no newspaper articles about budget allocations or staffing changes. The facility simply appeared in the public record in 1962 and then vanished from it entirely. Even the property tax record stopped in 1987, the entries replaced with a notation that read only, "Exempt State Archive Holding." The only other reference I could locate was a brief mention in a 1973 newsletter from the Massachusetts Archival Association, noting that the Crestfall facility had been designated for sensitive documents requiring climate-controlled isolation. The phrasing was odd. isolation rather than storage, as if the documents themselves needed to be quarantined rather than merely preserved. I departed Providence on a Tuesday morning in late October, the sky pressing down gray and dense, with the promise of rain that wouldn't arrive until evening. The drive took 3 hours, carrying me progressively away from the interstate and onto increasingly narrow roads that cut through forests, showing the first aggressive reds and oranges of autumn decay. The GPS directed me with confidence until the final 7 miles, at which point it seemed to lose certainty, the route recalculating 3 times before finally depositing me onto a single-lane access road, marked only by a weathered wooden post with faded numbers that matched my destination coordinates. The road itself was asphalt, but poorly maintained, with cracks that had widened into gaps where vegetation pushed through with persistent aggression. The forest pressed close on both sides, predominantly oak and maple, old growth that suggested this land had never been cleared for agriculture. The canopy created a tunnel effect, filtering the already dim October light into a perpetual twilight that made accurate time difficult to gauge. I drove for 23 minutes down this access road, my odometer marking the distance at just over 4 miles, though it felt considerably longer. The trees never varied in their density. No clearings appeared. No other roads branched off. Just the continuous corridor of forest and cracked pavement, curving gently in ways that prevented me from ever seeing more than 100 yards ahead. The Crestfall archive appeared without preamble, the forest simply ending at a clearing that felt carved rather than natural. The building sat in the exact center of this circular space, perhaps 200 yards in diameter, the ground covered in gravel that had gone gray with age and accumulation of organic debris. My first impression was of profound wrongness, though I couldn't immediately identify the source of this reaction. The structure itself was unremarkable in design, a rectangular concrete building, 3 stories tall, with the sort of minimal ornamentation characteristic of utilitarian government construction from the 1960s. The windows were narrow vertical slits, spaced at regular intervals, each fitted with what appeared to be darkened or reflective glass that prevented any view of the interior. A single entrance was visible on the front elevation, accessed by a short flight of concrete steps leading to a steel door, painted the same institutional gray as the building's exterior. What disturbed me, I gradually realized, was the building's relationship to its environment. It didn't sit on the land, it seemed to reject it. The gravel clearing maintained an absolute boundary with the forest, not a single sapling or weed breaching that circular perimeter. The building itself showed no signs of natural weathering. No moss colonized the north-facing concrete. No vines attempted to climb the walls. Even bird droppings, which typically accumulated on any horizontal surface, were absent from the window ledges and entrance overhang. The structure looked exactly as it must have appeared upon completion in 1962, ageless, in a way that defied the fundamental principles of material decay. I parked my sedan in front of the entrance and sat for several minutes, studying the building through my windshield while my mind attempted to process its wrongness. The silence outside was absolute. No wind rustled the trees at the clearing's edge. No birds called. Even the sound of my engine, once I'd turned it off, seemed to dissipate too quickly, absorbed by the surrounding stillness rather than echoing as it should have. The key had arrived by courier 2 days after I'd accepted the assignment. A single brass key on an unlabeled ring, accompanied by a typed note on letterhead from the Massachusetts State Archives Division. The note was brief. Dr. Vaughn enclosed key provides access to Crestfall Archive Facility. Complete architectural survey required. All interior spaces to be documented. Collection contents are not your concern. Complete survey within 6 weeks. Do not remove any materials. Contact this office upon completion. No signature. No contact number despite the instruction to call upon completion. The letterhead itself was oddly generic, lacking the typical bureaucratic information. No address, no departmental codes, just the agency name centered at the top of the page. I'd filed these irregularities in the portion of my mind reserved for institutional incompetence and thought nothing further of them. Now, standing before the building with that brass key solid and slightly warm in my palm, I found those details returning with uncomfortable insistence. The afternoon light, such as it was, had begun to fade toward evening. I gathered my equipment from the trunk, digital camera, laser measuring device, notepad, flashlight, and the leather satchel where I kept my architectural drafting tools. The temperature had dropped noticeably since I'd left Providence, and I shrugged into a heavier jacket before approaching the entrance. The concrete steps showed no wear despite decades of presumed use. My boots made hollow sounds against them that died too quickly, that same strange acoustic absorption I'd noticed with my car engine. The steel door had no handle, only a keyhole positioned at standard height beside the frame. I inserted the brass key and turned it. The mechanism moved with perfect smoothness, no resistance from rust or age, producing a single clean click that seemed to travel into the building's interior rather than outward. The door swung inward on hinges that made no sound whatsoever. Beyond the threshold was darkness, not the natural dimness of an unlit interior, but an absolute absence of light that seemed almost solid in its completeness. I clicked on my flashlight and directed the beam inside. The entrance hall was perhaps 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The walls painted a pale institutional green that had yellowed with time. The floor covered in linoleum tiles with a pattern of interlocking squares in 2 shades of gray. A reception desk occupied the left side of the hall, its surface empty except for a thin layer of dust. Behind the desk, a cork bulletin board hung on the wall, also empty save for a few rusted pushpins. What arrested my attention was the complete absence of decay. The linoleum showed no cracks, no lifting at the seams. The paint exhibited no peeling or bubbling. Even the dust on the reception desk appeared uniform and undisturbed, as if it had been carefully measured and distributed rather than accumulated naturally over time. I stepped inside, and the temperature change was immediate and dramatic, at least 15 degrees colder than the exterior, with a quality of dampness that suggested poor climate control. The air tasted of something I couldn't quite identify, a flavor that was simultaneously metallic and organic, like blood mixed with old paper. The door swung shut behind me with the same absolute silence as it had opened. I turned back and confirmed that it could be opened from the inside. No lock on this side, just a standard push-bar mechanism. The sight should have been reassuring, but instead it produced a knot of anxiety in my stomach that I couldn't rationally justify. I proceeded into the entrance hall, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness in a way that seemed inadequate, the light somehow thinner than it should have been, struggling against the shadows rather than dispelling them. To my right, a corridor extended deeper into the building. To my left, A stairwell, the steps descending downward. Directly ahead, past the reception desk, a set of double doors with wire-reinforced glass windows that showed only more darkness beyond. Standard institutional layout, entirely unremarkable. Yet every instinct I possessed was insisting that something was fundamentally wrong with this space, wrong in a way that transcended the usual unease of abandoned buildings. I'd spent 9 years entering abandoned structures. I was familiar with the particular anxiety such places produced, the consciousness of violation, of trespassing in spaces that had been surrendered by their rightful occupants. But this felt different. This felt less like abandonment and more like waiting. I forced these thoughts aside and began my documentation process, starting with the entrance hall. I photographed each wall systematically, then used the laser measure to record dimensions. The hall was exactly 15 feet wide and 19 feet, 7 inches deep. The ceiling height was 9 feet, 2 inches. All standard measurements for this type of construction, all precisely what they should have been. The reception desk contained 3 drawers, all unlocked. The top drawer held a collection of pens, all dried and useless, and a small notepad with pages yellowed but blank. The second drawer contained what appeared to be sign-in sheets, long forms with columns for name, time, purpose of visit, and materials accessed. I examined the top sheet. The last entry was dated March 17, 1987, the handwriting precise and bureaucratic. J. Morrison, 14, 35, quarterly inventory verification, stacks 712. 18 years before I'd received this assignment. I photographed the sign-in sheet and replaced it carefully in the drawer. The third drawer held only a ring of keys, perhaps 30 of them, each labeled with a small paper tag attached with string. The tags bore numbers and letter combinations: B27, S4E, ML3, A-Secure. I examined them but took none, though something in my mind suggested I should. The instruction had been clear: do not remove any materials. I moved to the double doors and pushed through. My flashlight revealed a large open room, roughly 50 feet square, filled with rows of standing shelves. The archive stacks. Each shelf unit was perhaps 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide, creating narrow aisles between them. The units extended into the darkness beyond my light's reach, suggesting the room was considerably larger than my initial estimate. I walked down the central aisle, my footsteps producing that same disturbing acoustic deadness, the sound seeming to be absorbed by the space rather than echoing as it should in a room of this size. The shelves on either side were filled with boxes, standard archival boxes, beige with black labeling areas. Each box bore a handwritten code, combinations of letters and numbers that followed no immediately discernible system. The air here was colder still, cold enough that I could see my breath, though the vapor seemed to hang suspended longer than it should, dissipating slowly as if reluctant to join the surrounding atmosphere. That strange taste was stronger, metallic and organic, and now with an additional quality that reminded me of ozone, the smell that follows lightning strikes. I selected a box at random from a shelf at shoulder height and carried it to the end of the aisle where I could set it on the floor and examine it properly. The code read 7M 1962 personnel restricted. I lifted the lid. Inside were personnel files, each in a manila folder with a tab bearing a surname and initials. I opened the first one, Kellerman, R. The file contained a standard employment application form, filled out in careful handwriting. Robert Kellerman had applied for a position as an archive clerk in August of 1962. He listed previous experience at the Boston Public Library. His references were librarians at institutions I recognized. Nothing unusual or noteworthy, except that the application had never been completed. The section for supervisor approval was blank. The start date field was empty, and clipped to the back of the application was a small slip of paper with a single handwritten word: withdrawn. I examined 5 more files from the box, all identical in structure, complete applications, appropriate references, all ending with that same notation: withdrawn, as if every person who had applied to work at this facility had subsequently changed their minds. I replaced the files and the box, photographing everything before I did so, then continued my survey of the archive stacks. The room was indeed larger than I'd initially estimated. My laser measure eventually determined it to be 93 feet wide and 107 feet deep, with a ceiling height that varied inexplicably, ranging from 12 feet at the center to only 8 feet near the walls, despite the exterior suggesting uniform floor heights. This architectural impossibility should have concerned me more than it did. Instead, I found myself accepting it with a strange passivity, as if the building had its own logic that superseded conventional geometry. I spent 3 hours documenting the first floor, photographing and measuring each space methodically. In addition to the entrance hall and main archive room, I found a small office suite, a supply closet containing nothing but empty shelves, and a bathroom with fixtures that showed no rust despite obvious age, the porcelain gleaming white in my flashlight beam with an almost aggressive cleanliness. By the time I'd completed the first floor documentation, true darkness had settled outside. I could see this through the narrow windows, not the gradual dimming of evening, but absolute blackness, as if the world beyond the building had simply ceased to exist. When I directed my flashlight toward a window, the beam seemed to stop at the glass rather than passing through, reflecting back at me with an oily quality that made my eyes water. I should have left then, should have returned to my car and driven back to Providence and emailed my supervisor that the assignment was beyond my capabilities. But the fee was substantial, and my lease payment was due in 2 weeks, and besides, what would I have said? That the building made me uncomfortable, that the windows didn't reflect light properly, that the air tasted wrong. Instead, I descended the stairwell to the basement level. The stairs were concrete, each step precisely the same height and depth as the one preceding it, the consistency so perfect it felt deliberate rather than merely well-constructed. The walls of the stairwell were unpainted concrete, and here I finally saw what I'd been unconsciously searching for on the exterior: signs of age and decay. The concrete showed water staining, dark streaks that suggested moisture intrusion. But when I touched one of these stains, my fingers came away dry, and the darkness seemed to shift slightly, as if it were on the surface of the wall rather than staining from behind it. The basement level was significantly colder than the first floor, cold enough that my breath created dense clouds of vapor that seemed reluctant to dissipate. The layout here was different. Instead of open rooms, I found a long corridor with doors on both sides, each door fitted with a small window of wire-reinforced glass and a label plate beside it. I proceeded down the corridor reading the labels: climate control, electrical, storage general, storage restricted. And then near the end of the corridor, 3 doors in succession labeled simply Deep Archive 1, Deep Archive 2, and Deep Archive 3. The brass key from my supervisor opened all the unrestricted doors. The climate control room contained machinery that looked vintage but well maintained, though none of it was running. The electrical room held a panel of circuit breakers, all in the on position, despite the building's lack of power. The general storage room was empty except for a stack of wooden pallets in one corner. The doors labeled storage restricted and deep archive did not respond to my key. I examined the locks, different mechanisms than the standard institutional hardware on the other doors. These were more complex, requiring keys I didn't possess. I photographed each door and its label, recorded the corridor dimensions, and was preparing to return to the first floor when I noticed something that made me pause. The corridor was approximately 80 feet long according to my laser measure. But when I'd measured the building's exterior, the foundation had been only 62 feet in the corresponding direction. I measured again carefully, checking my device's calibration. 80 feet, 3 inches. I walked back to the stairwell and measured from there to the far end of the corridor, counting my paces as well. The measurement was consistent. The interior of the basement level was approximately 18 feet longer than the exterior dimensions could accommodate. I stood in that cold corridor, my flashlight creating a pool of insufficient light around me, and felt the first real thread of fear work its way into my chest. Buildings didn't contain more space than their exteriors allowed. Geometry didn't work that way. Reality didn't work that way. But even as I thought this, I knew I would rationalize it. A measurement error, a misunderstanding of the exterior dimensions, some architectural feature I'd missed. The human mind has tremendous capacity for explaining away impossibilities, for forcing observed phenomena into acceptable frameworks even when those frameworks require increasingly absurd distortions. I returned to the first floor and then to my car. The cold had penetrated deep enough that my hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, staring at the building through the windshield. It looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived, ageless, wrong, sitting in its perfect clearing like something that had been placed rather than built. The narrow windows reflected nothing, showed nothing, revealed nothing. The entrance door was closed, though I had no memory of closing it when I'd exited. I should have driven away, should have abandoned the assignment and accepted whatever professional consequences followed. But I didn't. Instead, I started the engine and drove back down the access road, through the forest tunnel that seemed darker now, the trees pressing closer, until I reached the state highway and followed it to the nearest town. The town was called Millbrook, population 2,847, according to the sign at its border. A single main street with the usual assortment of rural establishments, a diner, a grocery store, a post office, 2 churches, and a bar called the Mill House that looked as though it had been constructed in the 1950s and never updated. I checked into the only motel, a single-story building with parking spaces directly in front of each room. The clerk was a woman in her 60s with careful hair and suspicious eyes that cataloged my appearance with practiced assessment. I paid cash for 3 nights, providing my real name when requested, but offering no explanation for my presence in Millbrook. "Business or pleasure?" she asked, though the question sounded pro forma, asked out of habit rather than genuine interest. "Documentation work," I said, "historical survey." Something shifted in her expression, not quite recognition, but a kind of wariness that suggested she'd heard something similar before. "What building?" State Archive Facility, about 30 miles northwest, Crestfall Archive. The change was immediate and pronounced. Her face closed down completely, all traces of curiosity vanishing behind a mask of careful neutrality. "Don't know it," she said, though the lie was obvious in the quickness of her response, the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. "It's on the property records," I said. "Built in 1962. Lots of old buildings around here," she said, handing me a key attached to a diamond-shaped plastic fob with the number 7 printed on it. "Don't know every one." She turned away then, busying herself with papers on the desk in a dismissal so clear it required no verbal reinforcement. I took my key and my single bag and found room 7. The room was exactly what I'd expected. A double bed with a thin comforter, a bathroom with rust stains around the faucets, a television bolted to a dresser, and a smell of old cigarette smoke that had penetrated too deeply into the fabric of the place to ever be fully removed. I showered in water that never got quite hot enough, then lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling while my mind attempted to process the day's observations. The dimensional inconsistency bothered me more than anything else. I'd worked in dozens of old buildings, documented countless structures with architectural oddities and construction peculiarities, but I'd never encountered space that simply didn't fit within its container. The explanation had to be error on my part, a miscounting of paces, a misreading of the laser measure, some perceptual distortion created by the darkness and the cold and the building's oppressive atmosphere. And yet I knew what I'd measured, knew it with the certainty of 9 years professional experience using the same equipment in the same methodical way. The basement corridor was 80 feet long. The building's exterior foundation was 62 feet in that direction. These facts couldn't coexist, but they did. I thought about the personnel files, all those withdrawn applications from people who decided not to work at the Crestfall Archive. I thought about the building's impossible preservation, its resistance to natural decay. I thought about the way sound died too quickly in its interior spaces, the way my flashlight beam seemed thinner than it should be, the way temperature dropped so dramatically between exterior and interior. Most of all, I thought about the locked doors at the end of the basement corridor. Deep Archive 1, 2, and 3 documents requiring isolation, sensitivity beyond normal classification. I should have been questioning why such a facility needed my documentation. Should have been wondering who had sent me here and why. Should have been examining the peculiar absence of normal bureaucratic oversight that had characterized this entire assignment. Instead, I was already planning tomorrow's survey. The 2nd floor, the 3rd floor, a more careful examination of those locked basement doors to determine what kind of keys they required. I was already committed to completion in a way that transcended professional obligation, driven by something that felt less like curiosity and more like compulsion. I slept poorly that night, waking repeatedly from dreams I couldn't quite remember, each time with the taste of metal and old paper and ozone sharp in my mouth, as if the building's air had followed me to the motel and was slowly displacing the breathable atmosphere around me. When I returned to the Crestfall Archive the following morning, I found the entrance door standing open. I was certain I'd closed it when I'd left the previous evening, certain with the kind of reflexive certainty that comes from habit. 9 years of entering and exiting abandoned buildings had ingrained the practice of securing doors behind me, both for safety and for professional ethics. Yet here it stood, open perhaps 2 feet, revealing that same absolute darkness beyond the threshold despite the morning light. I sat in my car for several minutes, studying the open door while my mind generated and discarded explanations. Wind seemed impossible. The door was too heavy, the hinges too well balanced to be moved by air current, and besides, there was no wind. The forest surrounding the clearing was perfectly still, not a leaf moving. An animal couldn't have opened it. The mechanism required a key from the exterior, and I had the only key. A person was theoretically possible, but who and why, and how would they have gained access? The most rational explanation was that I'd simply been mistaken about closing it. Memory was unreliable, particularly in stressful situations, and despite my professional comfort with abandoned buildings, the Crestfall archive had definitely produced stress. I'd convinced myself I'd closed the door because that's what I always did, but perhaps in my haste to leave, I'd skipped this particular step. I accepted this explanation because the alternative, that the door had opened itself, or that someone else had access to the building and had opened it during the night, introduced complications I wasn't prepared to address. I gathered my equipment and approached the entrance. The temperature was noticeably warmer than the previous day, the October sun actually providing some heat, which made the cold that radiated from the open doorway even more pronounced. I could feel it from 5 feet away, a wall of frigid air that seemed to pulse slightly, as if the building were breathing. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with that same absolute silence. The entrance hall looked identical to how I'd left it, the reception desk undisturbed, the bulletin board empty, the linoleum floor showing no new footprints in its uniform layer of dust. I checked the sign-in sheets in the desk drawer. The last entry was still from March 17, 1987. No one had added to the log. I proceeded to the second floor via the main stairwell. The stairs were the same perfect concrete as those leading to the basement, each step identical to the last. The second floor landing opened onto another corridor, this one with offices on both sides. Each office had a door with a frosted glass window and a name plate beside it. I examined the names: Director of Collections, Assistant Director, Processing Supervisor, Reference Librarian, Acquisitions Coordinator. Standard archival positions, all of them. The doors were unlocked, and I opened each in turn, documenting the interiors systematically. The offices were furnished but not occupied, as if everyone had simply stepped away for lunch and never returned. Desks held papers, file folders, pens, and holders. Bookshelves contained reference volumes about archival science, preservation techniques, cataloging standards. Filing cabinets were full of administrative documents, budgets, personnel records, acquisition proposals. What was absent was any sign of actual use. No coffee rings on the desks, no personal items, no photographs, no plants, no calendars or motivational posters, or any of the small human touches that accumulate in occupied workspaces. The papers on the desks were arranged too neatly, the pens aligned too precisely. These offices looked less like workspaces that had been abandoned and more like stage sets that had been designed to suggest workspaces, populated with appropriate props but never actually inhabited. I photographed everything, filled 3 pages of my notepad with measurements and observations, and tried to ignore the growing conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire facility. In the director's office, I found a filing cabinet containing correspondence. I photographed several documents at random. A letter dated July 15, 1982, from the State Archives Division to the Director, requesting status reports on project antecedent and expressing concern about timeline deviations. A memo from November 1984 discussing containment protocols and verification procedures. An undated note on yellowed paper, handwritten, that read simply, "The deeper sections show progressive instability. Recommend suspension of additional acquisitions until we better understand the spatial dynamics." None of this meant anything to me. None of it connected to anything I understood about archival work. But I photographed it all, added it to my documentation, and moved on to the next office. The third office I entered, labeled Processing Supervisor, contained something different. The desk here held a large ledger book, bound in dark green cloth, its pages filled with handwritten entries in multiple different hands. I opened it carefully, mindful of the aged paper. The ledger appeared to be an acquisition log, tracking materials as they entered the collection. Each entry included a date, a description of the materials, a source, and a destination location within the archive. The entries began in August 1962, shortly after the facility's completion, and continued in chronological order for several pages. August 12, 1962, Municipal Records, Ashford Township, 1847-1923. Source, Ashford Town Hall. Destination, Stacks 3A. August 19, 1962. Court Documents, Essex County Superior Court, 1889-1904. Source, Court Archives. Destination, Stacks 5B. Standard archival acquisitions, the sort of historical documents that government archives routinely collected. I skimmed forward through the ledger, watching the dates progress through the 1960s and into the 1970s. The entries remained consistent in their mundane nature: municipal records, court documents, tax rolls, property deeds. Then, in March of 1973, the character of the entries changed. March 23, 1973, Personal Effects Blackwood Investigation. Source, State Police Evidence Room. Destination, Deep Archive 1. Restricted access. April 7, 1973, Documentation, Henderson Psychiatric Hospital Incident. Source, Department of Mental Health. Destination, Deep Archive 1. Restricted access. May 12, 1973, Materials recovered, Millbrook excavation. Source, State Geological Survey. Destination, Deep Archive 2. Restricted access. The entries became progressively stranger, the descriptions less specific, as if the materials being acquired were difficult to categorize using standard archival terminology. September 3, 1976, Physical Samples Crestmont Phenomenon. Source, University Field Team. Destination, Deep Archive 2. Handle with SBECIFIED protocols. January 15, 1979. Recordings, Testimony Sessions 4793. Source, Special Commission. Destination, Deep Archive 3. No playback without authorization. June 8, 1981. Object Collection Site Designation K7. Source, Recovery Team Delta. Destination, Deep Archive 3. Extreme caution. I turned to the last page with entries. The final acquisition was dated February 28, 1987. Complete documentation, project antecedent, phases 1-4. Source, internal. Destination, Deep Archive 3. Final deposit, Facility protocols updated accordingly. After this entry, the remaining pages of the ledger were blank, though they showed signs of age identical to the filled pages. The same yellowing, the same slight brittleness at the edges, as if the book had been created complete, with both its filled and unfilled pages aging simultaneously. I photographed every page of the ledger, then returned it to the desk exactly as I'd found it. My hands were shaking slightly, and I realized the cold had penetrated deeper than I'd noticed. The temperature on the second floor was even lower than on the first, low enough that I could see my breath in dense clouds, low enough that my fingers were becoming clumsy. I moved methodically through the remaining second-floor offices, documenting each one, finding more of the same staged perfection, workspaces that looked inhabited but weren't, papers that suggested activity but showed no actual use. In the reference librarian's office, I found a card catalog, the sort of physical index that had been obsolete even in 1987. I pulled a drawer at random, the one labeled MIMZ. The cards inside were handwritten, each describing a collection or document set within the archive. Most were mundane: Manchester Township records, 1834-1891. Martin family papers, correspondence and diaries, 1902-1947. Massachusetts Agricultural Survey, regional reports, 1923-1931. But toward the back of the drawer, I found cards that matched the later entries in the acquisition ledger. Materials Blackwood Investigation, 1973, Deep Archive 1, restricted. See Collection Director for access approval. Contents, blank. Warning, review restricted protocols before handling. Documentation, Henderson Psychiatric Incident, 1973, Deep Archive 1, restricted. Contents, patient records, institutional correspondence, physical evidence. Warning, materials exhibit non-standard preservation requirements. Recordings, Commission Testimony 4793, 1979, Deep Archive 3, Extreme Restriction. Contents, audio recordings, transcripts, supporting documentation. Warning, playback produces documented psychological effects. Authorized personnel only. I photographed these cards as well, though my hands were shaking more severely now, the cold having worked its way through my jacket and into my core. I needed to leave, to return to my car and warm up before hypothermia became a genuine concern. But I was only halfway through the second floor documentation, and something in me insisted on completion, on thoroughness, on following my established professional protocols despite the building's wrongness. I pushed forward, room by room, office by office, photographing and measuring and recording. The cold intensified with each room, until by the time I reached the end of the corridor, my breath was creating vapor so thick it obscured my vision, and I'd lost feeling in my fingertips despite my gloves. The final door on the second floor wasn't an office. The nameplate beside it read simply, Observation. The door was locked, but the brass key from my supervisor opened it. Beyond was a room perhaps 10 feet square, completely empty except for a single large window that dominated the far wall. Not the narrow vertical slits that characterized the rest of the building. This was a proper window, perhaps 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, fitted with glass so clear it seemed almost absent. I approached the window and looked through it, expecting to see the forest clearing, the gravel ground, perhaps my car parked below. Instead, I was looking into a room. The room beyond the glass was large, cavernous, extending far beyond what should have been possible given the building's exterior dimensions. The floor was concrete. The walls were lined with shelving units that stretched upward into darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. The shelves were filled with boxes, containers, objects I couldn't quite make out in the insufficient light. This was impossible. I was on the second floor of a 3-story building. There was no room of this size inside the structure. There couldn't be. The geometry simply didn't allow for it. And yet there it was, visible through glass so clear I could have been looking at a photograph. Except that as I watched, something moved in the distant darkness of that impossible room. A figure, perhaps, or merely a shadow shifting as if in response to a light source I couldn't see. I stepped back from the window, and the cold that had been merely uncomfortable became suddenly, aggressively painful. A cold so intense it felt like physical pressure, as if the temperature itself had weight and was pressing against my skin, forcing its way into my lungs with each breath. I stumbled backward, away from the window, and the pressure lessened incrementally. My flashlight beam had grown noticeably dimmer, the batteries presumably affected by the extreme cold. But in that failing light, I could see something I'd missed upon entering the observation room. The walls were covered in writing. Not graffiti. The marks were too precise, too methodical. Someone had used a pencil or pen to cover every available surface with text, written in small, careful letters that filled the space from floor to ceiling. I approached the nearest wall and directed my flashlight at the writing, squinting to make out the words. The space doesn't terminate. We measured 247 feet before the equipment failed. Exterior walls are 62 feet. Discrepancy cannot be reconciled. Dr. Walcott insists this is intentional. Progressive expansion noted in weekly surveys. Rate of growth, approximately 3 inches per month in primary axis, 1.7 inches in secondary axis. Cubic volume increasing exponentially. Asked to suspend measurements. Refused. Terminated effective immediately. I moved along the wall, reading more passages. Personnel report auditory phenomena in deep archive sections, described as rhythmic, mechanical, organic, linguistic. No consensus on interpretation. Installed recording equipment. Playback shows only silence, but playback produces same psychological effects as direct exposure. Equipment removed. Phenomena continues. The Henderson materials arrived yesterday. They should not have been transported. Protocol violations at every level. Director insisted on immediate deposit in DA 1. I argued for standard processing, was overruled. Materials placed 14:00 hours. By 18:00, temperature in that section had dropped 11 degrees. By morning, 23 degrees. Climate control cannot compensate. Have submitted resignation. Project antecedent proceeding despite safety concerns. The specimens in DA3 exhibit spatial displacement consistent with theoretical models but inconsistent with physical law. Dr. Kellerman documented before withdrawal. His notes remain. Recommend immediate suspension. Recommendation ignored. The writing continued across all 4 walls. Hundreds of entries, some dated, most not, creating a palimpsest of concerns and observations and warnings that someone, multiple someones, based on the varying handwriting, had felt compelled to record directly on the walls themselves, as if official reports and memos were insufficient. I photographed what I could, though the density of the writing and the dimness of my failing flashlight made comprehensive documentation impossible. My core temperature had dropped to the point where my thoughts were becoming sluggish, my movements uncoordinated. I knew I needed to leave immediately, but some stubborn part of my professional identity insisted I at least document the observation window before departing. I turned back to face it, raising my camera with hands that barely responded to mental commands. Through the viewfinder, I saw the impossible room beyond the glass, its shelves extending into darkness, its dimensions defying the building's exterior constraints. And I saw the figure more clearly now. It was standing approximately 30 feet from the window, motionless, facing in my direction. The form was human-shaped but indistinct, as if I were seeing it through layers of distortion or interference. It stood with perfect stillness, and even at this distance, even through the obscuring darkness and the limitations of my failing vision, I had the absolute certainty that it was looking directly at me. I took the photograph. The camera's flash fired, bright and sudden in the dim observation room. The light struck the window and reflected back, and in that moment of reflection, I saw that the window was not glass. It was a mirror. I was looking at myself. The room beyond didn't exist. The shelves, the darkness, the impossible dimensions, all reflection, distortion, some trick of surface and light that had created the illusion of depth where there was only reflective coating. But even as I understood this, even as my rational mind insisted on this explanation, I knew it was wrong. Because the figure I'd seen in that room was still there, still visible in the mirror's surface, still standing motionless 30 feet away in a space that couldn't exist. And it wasn't my reflection. I fled. There's no other word for it. I turned and ran from that observation room with the last of my coordination, stumbling down the corridor, my camera swinging from its neck strap, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across walls and ceiling. I found the stairwell and descended in a controlled fall, my cold-numbed hands barely gripping the railing, my feet finding each step through muscle memory rather than conscious control. The first floor was warmer, marginally, enough that I could feel the return of sensation to my extremities as painful pins and needles. I didn't stop, didn't pause to document anything further, just continued straight through the entrance hall and out the front door into October sunlight that felt like a physical embrace. I made it to my car, fumbled my keys from my pocket with fingers that felt like clubs, and managed to unlock the door. I started the engine and turned the heat to maximum, then sat shaking while warm air gradually replaced cold in the vehicle's interior. When I could think clearly again, when my core temperature had risen enough that my thoughts no longer moved through syrup, I looked back at the building. It sat in its perfect clearing, ageless and wrong, its narrow windows reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. The entrance door was closed, though I had no memory of closing it. I drove back to Millbrook and my motel room, though it was only just past noon. I needed warmth, needed normalcy, needed to process what I'd seen and experienced in a space that felt safe and comprehensible. The motel room was exactly as I'd left it. Unmade bed, my few possessions scattered on the dresser, the smell of old cigarettes and industrial cleaner. I turned the shower to its hottest setting and stood under the water until the small tank heater was exhausted and the temperature began to drop. When I emerged, I sat on the bed with my laptop and began reviewing the photographs I'd taken. The entrance hall, the archive stacks, the offices, all exactly as I remembered them. The ledger pages were readable, the handwritten entries clear enough to transcribe. The catalog cards from the reference librarian's office had photographed well. The observation room was a different matter. The photographs of the walls with their dense writing were mostly illegible, the text too small and too numerous for the camera's resolution at that distance. I could make out occasional phrases, scattered words, but not enough to reconstruct the full content. The photograph of the observation window showed something that made my hands begin shaking again. In the image, the window was clearly reflective. I could see my own form in it, holding the camera, the flash creating a bright spot in the center of the frame. But beyond my reflection, visible in the mirror's depth, was the room I'd seen. The shelves extending into darkness, the impossible dimensions. And the figure, standing motionless, perhaps 30 feet back, human-shaped but indistinct. Not a reflection of anyone in the observation room, not a trick of light or shadow. An actual presence in a space that the photograph itself proved was only a reflection. I closed the laptop and sat in the gathering afternoon dimness, trying to construct explanations that would make sense of what I documented. A double reflection, perhaps, the mirror reflecting another mirror, creating the illusion of depth. Someone else in the building, standing in a position that created an unexpected reflection. A flaw in the camera, a digital artifact that resembled a human form. None of these explanations satisfied. None of them addressed the fundamental problem. I had looked into that window and seen a room that couldn't exist in a location where no room could be. I had seen a figure that wasn't my reflection standing in impossible space. And I had read, in the writing on the observation room walls, references to spatial displacement, to progressive expansion, to physical impossibilities that had been measured and documented by the very people who were supposed to be operating this facility. I thought about the acquisition ledger, about how the entries had changed character in 1973, shifting from mundane historical documents to restricted materials with warnings about handling protocols and psychological effects. I thought about Project Antecedent, referenced in multiple documents, apparently significant enough to warrant special commission oversight, but never adequately explained. Most of all, I thought about the instruction I'd received with the brass key. Complete architectural survey required. All interior spaces to be documented. All interior spaces. I hadn't completed the third floor. Hadn't examined whatever was housed there, hadn't fulfilled the terms of my assignment, and despite everything I'd experienced, despite the cold and the wrongness and the impossible geometry, I knew I would return to complete the documentation. Not because of professional obligation, not because of the fee, substantial though it was, but because something in that building had gotten into my head, had created a compulsion that felt less like curiosity and more like summons, and I lacked the strength or will or understanding to resist it. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my motel room, transcribing what I could read of the photographs, creating a timeline of the facility's operation based on the documents I'd found. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but consistent. The Crestfall Archive had been constructed in 1962 as a standard secure document storage facility. For the first 11 years of operation, it had functioned exactly as designed, accumulating historical records from various state agencies and municipal sources. In 1973, something had changed. The facility had begun accepting different materials, evidence from investigations, documentation from institutional incidents, physical samples and objects that required specialized protocols. Personnel had begun reporting anomalies, temperature fluctuations, auditory phenomena, spatial inconsistencies. By the early 1980s, the facility appeared to have transitioned entirely away from its original archival purpose toward something else, something involving Project Antecedent, about which I had almost no concrete information beyond the name and the apparent fact that it had been significant enough to require oversight from a special commission. In 1987, activity had ceased entirely. The last acquisition, the last entry in any log, the last signature on any document, all from February or March of 1987, after which the building had apparently been abandoned, left to sit in its forest clearing for 18 years with no maintenance, no personnel, no official attention, until someone had decided it needed architectural documentation and had hired me to provide it. Why document a building that had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades? Why the increased fee, the truncated briefing, the lack of normal bureaucratic oversight? Who had sent me that brass key, and why had they wanted me inside this structure? These questions circled through my mind as evening arrived and then full darkness. I ordered food from a diner down the street, ate without tasting it, and tried to sleep. My dreams, when they came, were of endless corridors that extended beyond architectural possibility, of rooms stacked inside other rooms like nesting dolls, of figures standing motionless in reflected spaces that shouldn't exist. I woke at dawn with the conviction that I needed information beyond what the building itself could provide. The writing on the observation room walls had mentioned Dr. Walcott, the same name listed as architect on the original construction permit. It had also mentioned Dr. Kellerman, apparently someone who had worked on Project Antecedent before withdrawing. Millbrook was a small town. People in small towns tended to remember things, particularly unusual things, and a secure state archive facility in the nearby forest qualified as unusual. Someone in Millbrook would know something about Crestfall, regardless of the motel clerk's insistence otherwise. I showered, dressed, and walked to the diner where I'd ordered food the previous evening. It was a classic small-town establishment, vinyl booths, a long counter with rotating stools, laminated menus featuring comprehensive breakfast options at prices that would have been reasonable in 1985. The clientele was predominantly elderly men in work clothes, their conversation a low rumble punctuated by occasional laughter. I took a booth and ordered coffee and eggs from a waitress whose name tag identified her as Linda. When she returned with my food, I asked, as casually as I could manage, "Have you ever heard of a place called the Crestfall Archive?" Her reaction was more subtle than the motel clerk's, but no less definitive. A slight pause in setting down my plate, a fractional tightening around her eyes. "Can't say I have," she said, her tone suggesting the conversation was finished. "It's a state facility," I persisted, "about 30 miles northwest of here, built in the 60s. Lots of old buildings around," she said, echoing the motel clerk's deflection almost word for word. "I wouldn't know about all of them." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen before I could ask anything further. I ate my breakfast slowly, watching the other patrons, noting the careful way they weren't looking in my direction despite clearly having overheard my question. Small-town discretion had a particular quality, not the aggressive dismissal of city suspicion, but a polite refusal to engage that was somehow more absolute. I was finishing my coffee when one of the elderly men from the counter stood and walked toward my booth. He was perhaps 75, with the sort of weathered face that suggested a lifetime of outdoor work, wearing faded overalls and a flannel shirt. "You asking about Crestfall?" he said quietly, sliding into the booth across from me without invitation. "I am. I'm doing documentation work there, architectural survey." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "They send you alone?" The question was odd enough that I answered honestly. "Yes. Is that unusual?" "Used to be teams," he said. "Back when it was operating. Never saw anyone go in or out alone. Always in pairs at minimum, usually more." "You saw the facility when it was active." "Worked timber in that forest for 40 years, he said. "You see things when you work in the woods, see people coming and going, see trucks making deliveries to places that aren't supposed to need deliveries." He paused, seemed to consider how much to say. "Place gave me a bad feeling. Most of the loggers wouldn't go near that part of the forest. Said the trees grew wrong there, too straight, too uniform. Said the animals avoided it." "What kind of deliveries?" I asked. "All kinds. Trucks from state agencies, universities, sometimes unmarked vehicles. This was mostly in the 70s and 80s. Stopped coming around 87, near as I remember." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "My nephew worked there for about 6 months. Kenny Kellerman. Smart kid, had a doctorate in something, physics, maybe, or mathematics. They recruited him special for some project they were running." Kellerman, the same name from the personnel files, from the references in the observation room writing. "Do you know what he was working on?" "Never would say. Signed some kind of agreement, couldn't talk about it. But he changed while he was there. Got quiet, nervous, started having trouble sleeping. Then one day he just quit, moved away to California, wouldn't talk about the place at all. Sent him a letter once asking what had been so bad about it. He wrote back one sentence. The space was wrong and we made it worse." The old man stood then, leaving as abruptly as he'd arrived. "You be careful in there," he said. "And don't go in the deep parts alone. They specifically had rules about that, about never going into certain sections without another person present." Kenny mentioned that much before he stopped talking about it entirely. He walked back to the counter, and I sat in the booth digesting this information. The deep parts, the deep archive sections that had been referenced in the ledger, in the catalog cards, accessible only through those locked doors in the basement. I paid for my breakfast and returned to my motel room, where I spent the next hour searching online for any information about Kenneth Kellerman. I found several academic papers he'd authored in the late 1960s and early 1970s, published in physics journals, dealing with theoretical topics I barely understood, non-Euclidean geometries, topological anomalies, mathematical models of spatial compression. The paper stopped abruptly in 1973, the same year the Crestfall Archives acquisitions had changed character. After that, nothing. No papers, no conference presentations, no trace of professional activity. I found what appeared to be his current address in Sacramento, California, but the phone number listed was disconnected. I opened my email and composed a message to my supervisor, Margaret Chen, carefully wording my request for information. Margaret working on Crestfall Archives survey, making good progress but have questions about building history and original purpose. Can you provide any additional context or documentation about the facility's operations? Also, are there any specific sections you need prioritized in the survey? Elias. I sent the email and waited. An hour passed, then two. Finally, a response arrived, but not from Margaret's usual email address. This came from a generic state archives division address I didn't recognize. Dr. Vaughn, complete survey of all accessible areas. Documentation required for facility disposition proceedings. No additional information available regarding operational history. Proceed with assignment. Contact this address upon completion. No signature. No answer to my actual questions. And notably, no instruction to avoid any areas, no safety warnings, no mention of the locked deep archive sections. I read the email 3 times, parsing it for subtext, for hidden meaning, for anything that might explain why I'd been sent to document this place. Facility disposition proceedings suggested the building was being prepared for some kind of official action, demolition, perhaps, or transfer to a different agency. But why would they need detailed architectural documentation for that? And why, after 18 years of apparent abandonment, was this suddenly urgent? I closed my laptop and sat on the motel bed, staring at the wall while my mind moved through possibilities. The most rational explanation was exactly what I'd been told. Routine bureaucracy, a facility that needed documentation before official disposition, an assignment that only seemed strange because I was allowing the building's atmosphere to affect my judgment. But I had measured that basement corridor, had photographed the impossible room beyond the observation window, had read the warnings written on walls by people who had worked in that facility, and found something wrong enough to drive them away. I should have declined the assignment at this point, should have informed my supervisor, whoever that actually was, that the building showed structural anomalies that made accurate survey impossible, that I lacked the expertise to document whatever was actually occurring there. Instead, I gathered my equipment and drove back to the Crestfall archive. The building looked the same, ageless, wrong, sitting in its perfect clearing with that absolute boundary between gravel and forest. The entrance door was closed, but when I approached with my key, I found it already unlocked, the mechanism turning freely, though I was certain I'd secured it when I'd fled the previous day. The interior was the same temperature as before, that dramatic drop from exterior warmth to frigid dampness that seemed to bypass all normal thermodynamic principles. I proceeded directly to the main stairwell and climbed to the 3rd floor, determined to complete this level's documentation before my nerve failed entirely. The 3rd floor layout was different from the 2nd. Instead of offices arranged along a corridor, I found a single large open space, perhaps 60 feet square, divided into sections by movable partitions. Each section appeared to be a research area, desks with laboratory equipment, shelving units with reference materials, chalkboards covered in equations and diagrams. I moved through these sections methodically, photographing everything. The equipment was vintage but sophisticated. Spectrometers, oscilloscopes, devices I couldn't identify with functions I couldn't guess. The reference materials included textbooks on advanced mathematics, theoretical physics, materials science, and subjects even more esoteric. One bookshelf contained nothing but volumes on architectural theory, specifically focusing on non-traditional spatial design. The chalkboards were covered in mathematics far beyond my comprehension, but I photographed them all, preserving whatever information they contained. On one board, someone had written in large letters, compression ratio 47, 1 stability questionable, recommend suspension. On another, Topological inversion confirmed in sector DA3. Physical access may be contraindicated. On a third, the Henderson materials are not stable. Dimensional bleeding observed at 72-hour mark. Containment proving insufficient. I found notebooks on several of the desks, filled with handwritten observations and calculations. I photographed page after page, creating a record I knew I wouldn't be able to interpret, but that seemed nevertheless important to preserve. In one notebook, dated July 1985, I found an entry that made me pause. Dr. Walcott insists the expansion is controllable, that the compression techniques can be safely maintained indefinitely. But the measurements don't support this. The space is growing autonomously now, independent of our input. What began as a useful application of theoretical principles has become something else, something that may have its own purpose beyond our intentions. I've recommended immediate suspension of all acquisitions to deep archive sections until we better understand the dynamics. Recommendation was rejected, beginning to question whether understanding is even possible at this point. I continued through the third floor, section by section, until I reached the far corner where I found something that stopped me completely. A door, not marked, not labeled, just a plain wooden door set into the wall where the building's exterior dimensions suggested there should be only exterior wall. I checked my measurements, my photographs of the building's exterior. This door should open onto empty air, onto the space 30 feet above the gravel clearing. I approached it slowly, my flashlight beam seeming thinner than ever, struggling against shadows that felt almost solid. The door had no lock, just a simple knob. I turned it, and the door swung inward silently. Beyond was a stairwell descending, not back down to the second floor. I could see the second floor landing through the open door behind me. This was a different stairwell, impossible in its location, spiraling down into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. I stood at the threshold, every rational instinct screaming at me to close this door and leave this building and never return. But the compulsion that had brought me back here, that had driven me to continue the survey despite every warning and impossibility, was stronger than rationality. I began to descend. The stairs were stone, not concrete like the other stairwells, each step worn in the center as if from long use despite the building's relatively recent construction. The walls were rough stone as well, without the painted surfaces that characterized the rest of the facility. The temperature dropped with each step, and the air took on that metallic organic ozone taste so strongly that I could barely breathe without gagging. I descended for what felt like far longer than should have been possible. The building was only 3 stories tall above ground, 1 below. Even accounting for the basement level, I should have reached bottom after perhaps 40 steps. I counted past 100, past 150, the spiral continuing downward in perfect geometric consistency. No variation, no landing, just stairs descending into cold and darkness. At step 217, the stairs ended at a landing, and I found myself facing another corridor. This one was carved from stone, the walls showing tool marks suggesting hand excavation, the ceiling perhaps 8 feet high, the width narrow enough that I could extend my arms and nearly touch both walls simultaneously. The corridor extended straight ahead into darkness, and along its length I could see doors, heavy wooden doors with iron hardware, each marked with a placard. I approached the first one and read the inscription, Deep Archive 1A. The door had no lock, just a heavy iron latch. I lifted it, and the door swung open with a groan of hinges that echoed down the corridor in ways that suggested vast space beyond what should have been possible. Inside was a room perhaps 20 feet square, its walls lined with shelving units. The shelves held boxes, containers, objects I couldn't immediately identify in my flashlight beam. I stepped inside, and the temperature dropped so dramatically that my breath came out as snow, actual crystalline particles rather than mere vapor. The nearest box bore a label, Blackwood Investigation Physical Evidence, 1973. I opened it carefully and found it filled with items sealed in plastic bags, clothing, personal effects, nothing that seemed unusual or remarkable. But touching the box made my skin crawl with a sensation I couldn't name, something beyond mere cold, as if the contents were emanating wrongness that could be felt through the cardboard and plastic. I photographed the box and its contents, then moved to the next shelf. More boxes, all carefully labeled with case numbers and dates, all related to investigations and incidents I didn't recognize. One box contained what appeared to be documents, papers covered in handwriting that seemed to shift and change when I tried to focus on it, the letters rearranging themselves in ways that made my eyes water and my head throb. I backed out of that room and continued down the corridor. Deep Archive 1B, Deep Archive 1C. Each room I opened contained similar materials, evidence from investigations, documentation from incidents, physical samples in sealed containers. All of it dated from the 1970s and early 1980s. All of it producing that same sensation of wrongness, of danger that couldn't be articulated or rationalized. The corridor branched, and I found myself in an intersection with passages leading in 4 directions. I marked my entry point carefully. I'd worked in enough buildings to know the danger of getting lost in unfamiliar spaces, and chose the left passage. This led to rooms labeled Deep Archive 2, and here the contents changed. Instead of box materials, these rooms contained larger objects, pieces of machinery, sections of walls with unusual markings, containers that seemed to be some kind of specialized housing. One room held nothing but a single large object beneath a canvas tarp. I lifted the edge of the tarp and found myself looking at a doorway. Not a door in a frame, just a doorway standing independently in the center of the room, its frame constructed of some dark wood carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The space within the frame showed only darkness, but it was a different quality of darkness than the surrounding room, somehow deeper, somehow more absolute. I lowered the tarp and backed out of the room quickly. My heart rate elevated in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with primal fear, the kind that bypasses rational thought entirely and triggers pure flight response. I should have left then, should have retraced my path back to that impossible stairwell and climbed back to the 3rd floor and departed this building and this assignment and never returned. But I didn't, because I'd realized something fundamental. The space down here was far larger than the building's footprint could accommodate. These corridors, these rooms, they extended outward in multiple directions, creating a warren of storage areas that would require an area hundreds of feet in diameter to contain. The building on the surface was perhaps 60 feet on its longest axis. The space below shouldn't exist. And yet it did. I was walking through it, documenting it, breathing its cold air and tasting its wrongness. The impossible was actual, the theoretical made physical, and I was standing in the proof of it. I continued exploring, taking photographs, measurements, notes that I knew wouldn't fully capture what I was experiencing. but that seemed nevertheless essential. I found rooms containing nothing but filing cabinets filled with documents I didn't dare read too closely, the text seeming to affect perception in ways that made sustained focus dangerous. I found rooms with recording equipment, the reels still threaded, labels warning against playback. I found rooms containing what appeared to be biological samples in preservation fluids, though the samples themselves were difficult to look at directly, as if my eyes refused to properly process their geometry. And everywhere on every surface, I found the same warnings written in pencil or marker or sometimes scratched directly into stone. Do not enter alone. Maintain visual contact with exit. Maximum exposure 30 minutes. Psychological effects cumulative. Report all temporal distortions immediately. I'd been down here. I checked my watch for 43 minutes. The time felt wrong, both too long and too short, as if duration itself was operating under different rules in this space. I needed to leave, needed to return to the surface, but I'd found one more corridor I needed to explore. The placard here read Deep Archive 3, and the doors along this passage were different from the others, heavier, fitted with multiple locks, each bearing a warning in red paint. Extreme caution, project antecedent materials, authorized personnel only. I tried the brass key on the first door, not expecting it to work, but it turned smoothly. The door opened, and I found myself looking into a space that made every other impossibility I'd encountered seem mundane by comparison. The room beyond wasn't a room. It was a void, actual empty space that extended in all directions farther than my flashlight could reach, the beam simply disappearing into blackness, without illuminating any walls or ceiling or floor. Except I was standing on a floor, could feel solid stone beneath my feet, yet when I directed my light downward it showed nothing but that same absolute darkness. Suspended in this void were objects, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process. Collections of what might have been machinery or might have been something organic, the distinction blurred beyond recognition. And throughout it all, that same figure I'd seen in the observation window's reflection, or many figures identical to it, standing at varying distances, all facing in my direction, all motionless. I backed out of that room and closed the door with hands that were shaking so violently I could barely grip the key to lock it. The compulsion that had driven me to explore, to document, to penetrate deeper into the facility's impossibilities had finally broken, replaced by pure terror. I ran, through the corridors, past the branching passages, back to where I thought I'd entered. But the corridor didn't end in stairs. It continued straight, offering no return path, no exit, just more doors and more passages and more impossible space extending in directions that shouldn't exist. I'd violated the most basic rule of exploring unfamiliar territory. I'd gotten lost, and in a space where geometry operated under non-standard rules, where corridors extended beyond their physical containers, being lost meant something far more dangerous than mere disorientation. I forced myself to stop running, to think methodically. I'd entered from a corridor on the right when facing the Deep Archive 1 entrance. I retraced that direction, checking each intersection, each junction, looking for the stone stairwell that would lead back to the 3rd floor. Time stretched strangely. Minutes felt like hours, or perhaps hours were passing as minutes. The consistency of duration had become unreliable, my watch showing times that didn't match my internal sense of elapsed intervals. My flashlight was dimming noticeably now. the batteries failing in the extreme cold, and I knew that if the light died completely in this maze of stone corridors, I would never find my way out. I forced myself to remember my professional training, the systematic approach to building documentation that had served me for 9 years. I stopped at the next intersection and used my knife to scratch an arrow into the stone wall, pointing back the way I'd come. Then I chose a direction, left, and followed it, scratching more arrows at each intersection. After what might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours, I found it. The stone stairwell, spiraling upward into darkness. I climbed, my legs burning with exertion, my lungs aching with the effort of breathing the wrong-tasting air, my flashlight creating a dim bubble of light that seemed to be actively resisted by the surrounding darkness. 217 steps, same as the descent. Then the wooden door, and beyond it the 3rd floor of the Crestfall archive, exactly as I'd left it. I stumbled through the open space with its research partitions, found the main stairwell, descended to the 1st floor, and emerged into the entrance hall. The front door was standing open. Beyond it, I could see daylight, afternoon light, golden and warm and completely impossible because I'd entered in the morning and couldn't have been in the building for more than a few hours despite how it had felt. I checked my watch, 4:47 p.m. I'd entered at 9:15 a.m. 7.5 hours, though it had felt simultaneously much longer and much shorter. I walked out into October air that felt almost painfully warm after the building's cold, into late afternoon sun that seemed impossibly bright, and I made it to my car before my legs gave out entirely. I sat in the driver's seat, shaking, while my mind tried to process what I'd experienced. The space below the building was vastly larger than the structure's footprint. I documented it, photographed it, walked through corridors that couldn't exist. I'd seen things in that final deep archive room that my eyes couldn't properly comprehend, that violated every principle of physical law I understood. And I'd lost time. 7.5 hours when it should have been perhaps 3 at most based on my movements and activities. I started the car and drove back to Millbrook, back to my motel room, and I didn't look at the Crestfall archive in my rearview mirror because I was afraid of what I might see if I did. That night, I downloaded all my photographs and backed them up to 3 different locations: laptop hard drive, external drive, cloud storage. Then I spent hours reviewing them, creating a comprehensive documentation of what I'd found. The 3rd floor research areas had photographed clearly, the equations and notes and equipment all visible in detail. The stone stairwell had photographed as expected, showing its spiral descent into darkness. The deep archive corridors and rooms had recorded adequately, though the photographs seemed flat somehow, failing to capture the spatial wrongness I'd felt so strongly in person. But the photographs of that final room, the deep archive 3 space with its void and suspended objects, showed only darkness. Not the darkness of insufficient light, just absolute black, as if the camera had malfunctioned or the shutter hadn't opened. Except the exposure information showed normal settings, normal operation. Whatever existed in that space simply wouldn't be captured by conventional photography. I wrote detailed notes to accompany each photograph, describing what I'd seen, what I'd measured, what I'd experienced. The dimensional impossibilities, the temperature anomalies, the warnings written on every surface, the figure or figures in the final archive room. I documented it all with professional precision, knowing even as I did so that it wouldn't be believed, couldn't be believed. because it violated too many fundamental assumptions about the nature of physical reality. When I finished, it was past midnight. I'd created a comprehensive architectural survey of the Crestfall archive, documenting all accessible areas just as I'd been instructed. The assignment was complete. Except it wasn't, because I hadn't documented all accessible areas. I'd avoided most of the Deep Archive 2 rooms, had barely glanced into several of the Deep Archive 1 spaces, and I'd only opened a single Deep Archive 3 room before fleeing in terror. Complete survey of all accessible areas. That was the instruction, and those areas had been accessible. I'd had the key, I'd opened the doors, I'd seen what lay beyond them. The fact that I'd chosen to retreat rather than conducting thorough documentation meant the survey was incomplete. I should have accepted this incompleteness, should have compiled what I had and submitted it and collected my fee and moved on to the next assignment. But that compulsion was back, stronger now, insisting on thoroughness, on professional completion, on returning to those impossible depths and documenting what I'd fled from. I slept poorly again, waking repeatedly with the taste of metal and old paper and ozone in my mouth, with the sensation of cold so intense it felt like pressure, with the memory of those motionless figures standing in void space, all facing toward me, all waiting with inhuman patience. Morning, I woke to find an email waiting in my inbox, not from the State Archives Division address that had sent the previous response, but from a personal email account I didn't recognize. K.W. Kellerman @ The subject line read, Crestfall Archive Warning. I opened it with hands that had already begun shaking. Dr. Vaughn, I received your name from a contact who monitors state contract assignments. If you are currently working at the Crestfall facility, stop immediately and leave. Do not attempt to complete the survey. The building is not what it appears to be. What we created there in the 1970s and 80s was based on theoretical work in non-Euclidean architecture and spatial compression. The goal was practical: create storage capacity that exceeded physical footprint constraints. Dr. Walcott had developed mathematical models suggesting that interior space could be folded to create additional volume without corresponding exterior expansion. The initial trials were successful. We achieved compression ratios of 3:1, then 5:1, then higher. The Deep Archive sections were the ultimate expression of this work, spaces that contained vastly more volume than their physical location could accommodate. But something went wrong. The spaces began expanding autonomously, beyond our input or control, and they began exhibiting properties we hadn't anticipated: time dilation, perceptual distortion. The materials stored in the Deep Archive sections started affecting the space around them, as if physical objects could somehow imprint themselves on geometry itself. By 1987, we'd lost control entirely. The building had become something other than a storage facility. The spaces inside were developing their own topology, their own rules. We sealed it and evacuated, recommending immediate demolition. But the state refused. Too many sensitive materials stored there. Too many questions about what would happen if we tried to destroy a structure whose interior didn't properly exist in our dimensional framework. We thought isolation would be sufficient. We were wrong. The building is still growing, still developing, still doing whatever it is that it does in that clearing. If you've entered the Deep Archive sections, you've been exposed. The psychological effects are cumulative and permanent. You'll feel compelled to return, to explore further, to penetrate deeper into spaces that become progressively less compatible with human consciousness. Don't go back. Whatever they're paying you is not worth what you'll lose. Kenneth Kellerman, Ph.D. I read the email 3 times, then read it again. Everything Kellerman described matched what I'd experienced. The dimensional impossibilities, the autonomous expansion, the compulsion to explore despite every rational warning. But the email raised more questions than it answered. If the facility had been sealed in 1987, why was I being sent to document it now, 18 years later? Who had authorized this survey and for what purpose? And most critically, what was the actual goal of this assignment? I composed a response to Kellerman's email. Dr. Kellerman, thank you for the warning. Can you tell me who authorized the current survey? I was hired through normal channels, Massachusetts Historical Architecture Preservation Society, but the assignment details were sparse. Do you know why the state would want documentation now, after 18 years of isolation? I sent the email and waited. An hour later, a response arrived. There is no current survey. I maintain contacts at State Archives Division. They have no record of any Crestfall documentation project. Whatever organization hired you, it wasn't the state. This is a pattern we observed during operation. The building seems to want to be explored. Personnel reported feeling compelled to enter restricted areas, to investigate sealed sections, to penetrate deeper into the archive levels. We thought it was psychological, curiosity, professional interest, normal human impulses. But it was more than that. The building was calling them. Check your hiring documentation carefully. Look for inconsistencies. I suspect you'll find that the assignment didn't come from where you think it did. And Dr. Vaughn, if you've already entered the deep archive 3 sections, it may be too late. Those spaces are the most unstable, the most alien. Prolonged exposure produces permanent changes in spatial perception and cognitive function. Some of our researchers never fully recovered. Don't go back, KK. I opened my laptop and pulled up the original assignment email from my supervisor, Margaret Chen. I read it carefully, looking for details I'd glossed over in my initial acceptance. The email was from Margaret's work address, used her standard signature format, referenced projects we'd worked on together. Everything appeared legitimate, but I noticed now that the sending time was 2:47 a.m., unusual for Margaret, who was meticulous about work-life boundaries and never sent emails outside business hours. I scrolled through my email history with Margaret, comparing this message to previous assignments. The tone was slightly different, more terse, less of her characteristic warmth, and the fee structure was wrong. Margaret always broke down payment schedules in detail. This email had just listed a total amount. I called Margaret's office number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her standard greeting, her voice, her extension. I left a message. Margaret, it's Elias. I have some questions about the Crestfall archive assignment. Can you call me back? Then I called the Massachusetts Historical Architecture Preservation Society main office. A receptionist answered, and I asked to speak with Margaret Chen. I'm sorry, but Ms. Chen is on medical leave, the receptionist said. She's been out for the past 3 weeks. Can someone else help you? 3 weeks. The Crestfall assignment had arrived in my inbox 19 days ago, while Margaret was already on leave. Can you tell me who's covering her projects? I asked. my voice steady despite the growing conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. "That would be David Brennan. Would you like me to transfer you?" "Yes, please." The call transferred rang twice, and a man's voice answered, "David Brennan." "Mr. Brennan, this is Dr. Elias Vaughn. I'm working on a survey project that I thought was assigned through Margaret Chen, but I just learned she's on medical leave. Can you tell me who authorized the Crestfall archive documentation?" A pause. "I'm not familiar with that project. Let me check our active assignments." I heard keyboard clicks, a longer pause. "I'm not seeing any Crestfall project in our system. Can you give me the contract number?" I pulled up the assignment email again. There was no contract number, no reference code, none of the standard bureaucratic identifiers that accompanied legitimate state projects. "There isn't one listed in the assignment email," I said slowly. "The email came from Margaret's address 3 weeks ago, but you're saying she was already on leave then." More keyboard clicks. "Dr. Vaughn, I'm showing that Margaret's email account was compromised during the first week of her medical leave. We had to reset her password and audit her sent messages. This was, let me see, October 12th. Did you receive the assignment before or after that date?" "After," I said, "October 15th. Then it didn't come from Margaret. Someone was using her compromised account. I'll need to report this to our IT security team. Can you forward me that email?" I forwarded it, then sat in my motel room while the implications settled over me with the weight of concrete. Someone had hacked Margaret's email account and sent me a fabricated assignment. Someone had provided me with a key to the Crestfall archive. Someone had wanted me inside that building. The building was calling them, Kellerman had written. The building seems to want to be explored. Not metaphorically, not psychologically, actually calling, using whatever methods were available, compromised email accounts, fabricated assignments, keys that appeared in courier packages with forged documentation. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a Massachusetts number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Dr. Vaughn," a woman's voice, professional, crisp. "This is Sandra Hirsch with the Massachusetts State Archives Division. We need to discuss your current location and activities immediately." "I'm in Millbrook," I said, "working on a survey of the Crestfall archive facility." "No, you're not," she said firmly. "You can't be, because the Crestfall facility has been under federal seal since 1987. Access is strictly prohibited. If you've entered that building, you've violated federal law and potentially endangered yourself significantly." "I have a key," I said. "I was sent a key and assignment documentation." "From whom?" "I thought from my supervisor at the Historical Architecture Preservation Society, but I just learned her email was compromised." A long pause. "Dr. Vaughn, I need you to listen very carefully. Do not return to that facility under any circumstances. Do not enter the building again. There are safety protocols in place that—" She stopped abruptly, and I heard muffled conversation, as if she'd covered the phone to speak with someone else. When she returned, her tone had changed, become more measured. "I need you to tell me exactly what you've accessed inside the facility." I described my exploration. The 3 floors, the basement level, the impossible stone stairwell, the deep archive sections. As I spoke, I heard more muffled conversation on her end. Voices I couldn't make out, but that sounded urgent, concerned. "The deep archive 3 section," she said when I finished. "You opened doors in that section." One door, I said. I saw there was a void space. Objects suspended in it, figures. How long were you exposed to that space? Less than a minute. I closed the door and left immediately. More muffled conversation, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was very careful, very controlled. Dr. Vaughn, I'm going to give you an address. I need you to drive there immediately. It's a facility about 2 hours from your current location. There are people there who need to examine you to assess your exposure. Exposure to what? The Crestfall archive contains materials that produce documented psychological and perceptual effects. You've been in contact with these materials for an extended period. We need to determine whether you've experienced any lasting impacts. You mean the building has contaminated me with something? Not contaminated, affected. The distinction is important. This isn't biological or chemical exposure, it's topological. The spaces you entered exist in configurations that human consciousness isn't adapted to process. Prolonged exposure produces changes in spatial perception, temporal awareness, sometimes in fundamental cognitive architecture. We need to assess what changes, if any, you've experienced. I thought about the time dilation I'd felt in the deep archive sections, the way duration had become unreliable. I thought about the compulsion that had driven me to explore despite every warning, that even now was insisting I needed to return, to document the areas I'd left incomplete. And if I refused to go to this facility, I asked. Another pause. Then you'll likely return to Crestfall. Everyone with deep archive exposure experiences the compulsion. It's not psychological, it's geometric. The spaces you entered have created a kind of resonance with your perceptual architecture. You'll feel pulled back, feel that the survey is incomplete, that you need to explore further. And each return will make the effect stronger, until eventually you won't be able to leave. People have been trapped there. Not trapped in the conventional sense, but yes, individuals who spent too long in the deep archive sections lost the ability to maintain stable existence in normal geometric space. They exist now in a kind of liminal state, present in the facility but not fully compatible with standard dimensional framework. The figures, I thought, the motionless forms I'd seen standing in that void space in Deep Archive 3, not stored objects, not specimens, people, researchers and personnel who'd spent too long in impossible spaces and had become part of those spaces themselves. The address, I said quietly. Give me the address. She did, along with a name to ask for upon arrival. Then, Dr. Vaughn, it's important that you understand. You may not fully recover. Deep Archive 3 exposure has produced permanent changes in every documented case. But if you come to the facility, we can at least monitor your condition, potentially mitigate some of the more severe effects. And if the changes have already occurred, then we'll discuss options at that point. But please do not attempt to return to Crestfall. Do not go back into those spaces. The building is not a building anymore. It's something else, something that we don't fully understand and can't fully control. It wants to be explored, wants to pull people deeper into its impossible geometries. Don't let it. She ended the call, and I sat in the motel room with afternoon light slanting through the window, ordinary October light in an ordinary New England town, while my mind processed the fact that I'd been fundamentally altered by exposure to spaces that shouldn't exist. The compulsion was real. I could feel it even now, a pull like gravity, insisting that I needed to return to Crestfall, that my documentation was incomplete. that there were rooms I hadn't photographed, corridors I hadn't measured, spaces I hadn't explored. The feeling was separate from my conscious thought, operating at a deeper level, as if my spatial awareness itself had been rewritten to include the archive as a kind of permanent destination. I packed my equipment methodically, loaded it into my car, and prepared to drive to the address Sandra Hirsch had provided. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that this wouldn't be the end. The Crestfall archive had gotten into my head, had altered something fundamental in how I perceived and related to space. I would go to this facility, would submit to whatever examination they required, would cooperate fully with their assessment and monitoring. But eventually, days or weeks or months from now, I would return to that clearing in the forest, would enter that building that contained more space than it should, would descend that impossible stairwell and walk those stone corridors and open those heavy wooden doors. Because the survey was incomplete, because there were spaces I hadn't documented, because something in those deep archive sections was calling, had been calling since 1987, and would continue calling until I or someone like me penetrated deep enough to find whatever was at the center of those impossible geometries. I started driving, following the GPS directions to the facility Hirsch had specified. But in my rearview mirror, I could see the forest, could feel the archive sitting in its clearing 30 miles to the northwest, patient in its wrongness, waiting for my inevitable return. The facility turned out to be an unmarked concrete building on the outskirts of a town called Berkshire Falls, surrounded by chain-link fencing, and looking for all the world like an abandoned warehouse. I parked in the gravel lot and approached the single door, where a keypad waited beside the frame. I called the number Hirsch had given me. She answered immediately. "I'm here," I said. "Good. The entry code is 47826. Someone will meet you in the lobby." The code worked, and I entered a sterile hallway that led to a small reception area. A man in his 50s, wearing business casual clothing that couldn't quite disguise his military bearing, stood waiting. "Dr. Vaughn, I'm Colonel Marcus Webb. Thank you for coming." He extended a hand and I shook it. His grip was firm, assessing. "Please follow me." He led me through a series of corridors into a medical examination room, standard equipment, examining table, instruments, nothing unusual or threatening. A woman in a white coat was waiting, introducing herself as Dr. Patricia Ramos. "We're going to run some tests," she said. "Cognitive function, spatial reasoning, temporal perception, memory assessment. Nothing invasive, just standardized evaluations. Then we'll need to conduct a detailed interview about your experiences at Crestfall. The whole process will take several hours. Are you comfortable proceeding?" I nodded, and the examination began. The cognitive tests were straightforward: pattern recognition, problem solving, memory exercises, spatial orientation tasks. I performed adequately on most of them, though I noticed occasional distortions in my perception of the test materials. Lines that should have been straight seemed to curve slightly. Distances that should have been uniform appeared to vary. Nothing dramatic, nothing that significantly impaired my function, but noticeable. The temporal perception tests were more disturbing. Dr. Ramos would ask me to estimate elapsed time between two events, a tone sounding, a light flashing. My estimates were consistently wrong, sometimes dramatically so. What I perceived as 30 seconds might be 45. What felt like 2 minutes might be 90 seconds. The inconsistency was itself inconsistent, following no pattern I could identify. This is typical of deep archive exposure, Dr. Ramos said, making notes on her tablet. Your internal chronometry has been affected by exposure to spaces where time moves differently. It usually stabilizes somewhat, though full recovery is rare. After the cognitive tests came the interview. Colonel Webb joined us, and together they walked me through my entire experience at Crestfall, from receiving the fabricated assignment through my exploration of the deep archive sections. They recorded everything, asked detailed questions about specific observations, requested clarification on measurements and timings. When I described the void space in Deep Archive 3, the objects suspended in darkness, the figures standing motionless, both of them became very still, very focused. "How many figures did you observe?" Webb asked. "I'm not certain. At least 5, possibly more. It was difficult to determine distances in that space. And they were motionless, no movement at all. None that I could detect. They appeared to be standing, all facing toward the door." Webb and Ramos exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "Did any of them move toward you?" Ramos asked. "No, they just stood there, watching or waiting or existing. I don't know how to describe it better than that." "Did you feel compelled to approach them, to enter that space more fully?" I thought about it carefully. No, that was the first time I felt genuine fear rather than just unease. My reaction was to close the door and leave immediately. "Good," Webb said. "That's a positive indicator. If you'd felt drawn to enter that space, to approach those figures, it would suggest deeper topological integration." "What are they?" I asked. "Those figures, are they people? Former personnel who were exposed too long?" Another exchange of looks. "We believe so," Ramos said, "but we don't know for certain." The Deep Archive 3 section was sealed in early 1987 after 3 researchers failed to return from a documentation expedition. Search teams found their equipment at the entrance to one of those void spaces, but the researchers themselves couldn't be located. Approximately 6 weeks later, personnel observing through remote cameras reported seeing figures in those spaces, standing motionless, positioned at various distances from the entrance, all facing outward. "Are they alive?" "We don't know. They don't move, don't respond to stimuli, don't appear to age. They exist, but whether that constitutes life in any meaningful sense is unclear." I sat with this information, processing the implication that I'd come within minutes of joining those figures, of being trapped in a space so fundamentally alien that my physical form would persist, but my consciousness might be lost entirely. "Why hasn't the facility been destroyed?" I asked. "If it's this dangerous, this unstable, why not demolish it?" Webb sighed. "We tried. In 1988, we brought in demolition teams prepared to level the structure and fill in whatever spaces existed below ground. But the first attempt to breach the exterior walls failed. The concrete resisted all conventional demolition techniques. We tried explosives, cutting torches, even a wrecking ball. Nothing worked. The building's material structure had become resistant to destruction. Topologically reinforced," Ramos added. "The same principles that allowed it to contain more space, then it should also made it functionally indestructible. The interior geometry supports the exterior structure in ways that bypass normal material limitations." "So it just sits there," I said, "growing, developing, calling people to explore it." "We monitor it," Webb said. "Satellite surveillance, periodic perimeter checks, network monitoring for any mentions that might indicate unauthorized access. Until 3 weeks ago, when someone compromised the email account of your supervisor and sent you that fabricated assignment, we'd successfully prevented anyone from entering for more than 18 years. Who did it? Who sent me there? We don't know. The email was routed through multiple proxies. The courier package was paid for with a prepaid credit card purchased with cash. Whoever arranged your assignment was sophisticated enough to avoid leaving traces we could follow. Or, Ramos said quietly, it wasn't who but what. Dr. Vaughn, one of the theories about Crestfall is that the building itself has developed something approximating intention. Not consciousness as we understand it, but a kind of purpose that emerges from its topological structure. It wants to expand, to grow, to incorporate more space and more matter and more awareness. And it needs people to do that. Needs us to enter it, to explore it, to penetrate deeper into its geometries, until we become part of its structure. The compulsion, the calling, not psychological manipulation, but something more fundamental, the building reaching out through whatever means available, finding susceptible individuals, drawing them in. How long do I have, I asked, before the compulsion becomes irresistible? It varies, Ramos said. Some individuals resist for months, others return within days. The severity of exposure, individual neurological factors, strength of competing motivations, all of these influence the timeline. But everyone returns eventually. Everyone we've documented, yes. The pull becomes stronger over time rather than fading, and each return reinforces it further, creates deeper topological integration, makes the next return even more inevitable. I looked at both of them, these professionals who'd spent years studying the Crestfall phenomenon, monitoring its growth, documenting its effects. How many people have been lost to it? Since 1987. 17 that we know of, Webb said. Hikers who wandered too close and felt drawn to investigate. Journalists pursuing rumors of a mysterious government facility. One film crew that was making a documentary about abandoned buildings. All of them entered despite our best efforts at containment. None of them came back out in any meaningful sense. And now me. And now you, Ramos confirmed. Though you have an advantage the others didn't, you know what you're dealing with. You understand the mechanism, and you came to us before making a second visit. That gives us some options. What options? Cognitive countermeasures, she said. Training techniques to recognize and resist the compulsion. Pharmaceutical interventions that may help stabilize temporal and spatial perception. Most importantly, ongoing monitoring and support. You won't face this alone. We spent the next hour discussing these interventions in detail. The cognitive techniques were essentially advanced meditation practices combined with spatial grounding exercises, methods to maintain awareness of normal geometric relationships, to resist perceptual distortions, to recognize when the compulsion was actively influencing thought processes. The pharmaceutical options were experimental, compounds that affected neuroplasticity and spatial processing in ways that might counteract the topological changes produced by deep archive exposure. Success rates were modest at best, but the side effects were minimal. The monitoring would be continuous. I'd be required to check in daily, to report any changes in perception or increases in compulsive urges, to submit to periodic reassessment at this facility. And if all of this fails, I asked, if I eventually return to Crestfall despite everything, Then we track you, Webb said bluntly. We have sensors positioned around the facility's perimeter. If you enter, we'll know within minutes. We'll come for you, attempt extraction before you penetrate too deep. Success rate for extraction decreases dramatically after 30 minutes inside, drops to near zero after 2 hours. But we'll try. Has extraction ever worked? Have you ever recovered someone who'd returned? A pause. Twice, Ramos said. Out of 17 attempts, and both individuals required extensive ongoing care, never fully recovered normal spatial perception. But they're alive, functional in limited capacities. It's better than the alternative. I left the facility that evening with a bottle of experimental medication, a printed guide to the cognitive countermeasures, and a dedicated phone number to call anytime I felt the compulsion intensifying. I drove back to Millbrook as darkness settled over the October landscape, and I checked into my motel room one final time. I should have driven back to Providence immediately, should have put distance between myself and the archive, should have started the process of resistance and recovery. But I didn't, because the documentation was still incomplete, because I'd left equipment in the third-floor research area, because the survey, my professional obligation, remained unfinished. These were rationalizations, I knew. Excuses generated by the topological integration Ramos had described, by the building's pull working through my thoughts and generating apparently logical reasons to return. But knowing this didn't diminish their force. The compulsion wasn't crude. It didn't override conscious thought, but instead worked through it, creating motivations that felt authentic, rational, necessary. I spent the night reviewing my photographs again, cataloging what I documented and what remained unexplored. The first floor complete, the second floor complete, the third floor perhaps 80% complete, missing only detailed documentation of some of the research areas. The basement corridor, basic documentation only, lacking detailed measurements. Deep Archive 1, minimal documentation, only a few rooms explored. Deep Archive 2, even less, perhaps 5% of the total space. Deep Archive 3, a single room opened, immediately closed. An incomplete survey, unprofessional work, unacceptable by any standard of architectural documentation. I took the experimental medication, 2 pills with water, per Ramos's instructions, and practiced the cognitive countermeasures until I could execute them smoothly, grounding myself in normal geometric relationships, focusing on stable spatial anchors, recognizing the intrusive quality of compulsive thoughts. It helped marginally. The pull toward crestfall didn't disappear, but it became more clearly distinguishable from my authentic thoughts and motivations. I could identify it, label it, separate it from genuine professional obligation. But identification wasn't elimination. The compulsion remained patient and persistent, waiting for any lapse in vigilance, any weakening of resistance. I slept poorly and woke to find I'd been dreaming of corridors, of rooms that extended beyond their boundaries, of figures standing in void spaces with inhuman patience. The dreams felt less like imagination and more like memory, as if some part of me had returned to Crestfall while my body slept in the motel bed. I checked out of the motel that morning and drove back to Providence, back to my third-floor apartment with its view of a brick wall, back to ordinary life and ordinary work and ordinary geometric space that behaved according to standard physical principles. For 3 days, I maintained this normalcy. I took the medication. I practiced the countermeasures. I checked in with Ramos daily, reporting stable condition, manageable compulsion levels, no significant perceptual distortions. On the fourth day, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Survey completion required." I should have deleted it immediately, should have recognized it as another manipulation, another method by which the building was reaching toward me. But I opened it. Dr. Vaughn, your architectural survey of Crestfall Archive remains incomplete. Professional standards require comprehensive documentation of all accessible spaces. Please return to complete your assignment. The building is waiting. No signature. No explanation of who had sent it or how they knew about my incomplete survey. I forwarded it to Ramos. She called within the hour. "This is the building," she said without preamble. Not metaphorically. The topological structure has developed enough sophistication to reach out through digital networks, to generate communications that reinforce the compulsion. Delete the email and any responses. Don't engage with it. I deleted it, but the message had served its purpose. The compulsion had intensified noticeably, the pull toward Crestfall stronger than it had been since my return to Providence. I lasted another week before I started planning my return trip. The planning itself was a warning sign, I knew, a manifestation of the compulsion working through my conscious thoughts, generating apparently rational justifications. But I couldn't stop. Each day, the pull grew stronger, the sense of incomplete work more urgent, the need to return more overwhelming. I told myself I could resist, told myself I would take every precaution, would maintain strict time limits, would only document the remaining third-floor areas and then leave immediately. Told myself I could make one final visit without penetrating back into the deep archive sections, without exposing myself to further topological integration. These were lies, and I knew they were lies even as I told them to myself. But knowing didn't matter. The building was calling, and I no longer had the strength to refuse. On the morning of the 11th day after my initial departure from Crestfall, I loaded my equipment into my car and began driving northwest. I'd informed Ramos of my decision the previous evening, and she'd responded with resignation rather than surprise. "We'll be monitoring," she'd said. "Extraction team will be standing by. You'll have approximately 30 minutes before the topological integration becomes irreversible. Don't exceed that limit, Dr. Vaughn, please." I drove through October landscape that had progressed further into autumn, the trees now showing more bare branches than leaves, the morning cold enough to frost the windshield. The access road appeared exactly where I remembered it, and I followed its cracked asphalt through the forest tunnel toward the clearing. The Crestfall Archive sat waiting, ageless and wrong, exactly as I'd left it nearly 2 weeks prior. The gravel clearing maintained its absolute boundary with the forest. The narrow windows reflected nothing. The entrance door stood closed. I parked and sat for several minutes, practicing the cognitive countermeasures, grounding myself in normal geometric relationships, preparing myself for the building's effects. Then I gathered my equipment and approached the entrance. The brass key turned smoothly, and the door swung inward on silent hinges. The interior was exactly as before. The entrance hall with its reception desk and bulletin board. The temperature dropped so dramatic it felt like passing through a physical barrier, the air tasting of metal and old paper and ozone. I proceeded directly to the 3rd floor, moving quickly through spaces I'd already documented. heading for the research areas I'd left incompletely surveyed. I photographed equipment, measured partitions, recorded details I'd missed during my initial rush documentation. The compulsion pulled toward the wooden door at the far corner, toward the impossible stairwell and the deep archive sections below. But I resisted, focused on completing the third-floor survey, maintained awareness of elapsed time. 20 minutes. I'd been inside for 20 minutes and the third floor was now comprehensively documented. I should leave, should return to my car and drive away and never come back. But the survey was still incomplete. The deep archive sections remained largely unexplored. Hundreds of rooms I'd never entered, corridors I'd never measured, spaces I'd never photographed. Professional standards required comprehensive documentation. The rationalization was transparent, but it didn't matter. I was already moving toward that wooden door, already opening it, already beginning my descent down the stone stairwell into cold and darkness that intensified with each step. 217 steps, and I emerged into the stone corridor with its heavy wooden doors. Deep Archive 1A, 1B, 1C. I'd explored only a few of these rooms during my first visit. Now I opened each door systematically, photographing contents, recording dimensions, creating the comprehensive documentation that professional practice demanded. Time moved strangely. I'd check my watch and find that minutes had passed when it felt like seconds, or that hours had elapsed when my internal sense suggested only minutes. The temporal distortion made it increasingly difficult to track how long I'd been inside, whether I was approaching or exceeding the 30-minute limit before extraction became impossible. I moved through Deep Archive 1, then into Deep Archive 2, opening room after room, documenting contents that became progressively harder to comprehend. Objects that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Containers whose interiors were larger than their exteriors. Documents covered in text that rearranged itself when observed directly. And throughout it all, the compulsion pulled deeper, toward the Deep Archive 3 section, toward those rooms with their red-painted warnings and their impossible void spaces, toward the figures standing motionless in darkness, waiting with inhuman patience for someone to join them. I was approaching one of those doors, Deep Archive 3C, different from the room I'd opened during my first visit, when I heard voices echoing through the stone corridors, human voices calling my name. The extraction team. Webb had sent them in, had come for me before the 30-minute limit expired. Dr. Vaughn, Elias Vaughn, call out if you can hear us. I should have responded immediately, should have retraced my path toward those voices, should have allowed them to guide me back to the surface. But the door was right here, and I had the key, and the survey was still incomplete, and surely I had time to document just one more room before returning. I opened the door to Deep Archive 3C. Beyond was void, the same absolute darkness I'd seen in the first Deep Archive 3 room, with geometric impossibilities suspended throughout, objects that hurt to perceive directly. And the figures, at least 8 of them visible in the insufficient light, standing at varying distances, all facing toward the doorway. All facing toward me. This time I felt the pull, not just the general compulsion that had brought me back to Crestfall, but something more specific, more immediate. An invitation almost, or perhaps a recognition. The figures weren't hostile or threatening. They simply existed, present in this impossible space, and something in that presence was calling to me with a force that bypassed conscious thought entirely. I stepped forward, over the threshold into the void. The stone floor remained solid beneath my feet despite my eyes showing only darkness below. I took another step, then another, moving toward the nearest figure. As I approached, it resolved more clearly, human-shaped, wearing clothing that looked decades out of date, its features blurred as if I were seeing it through distortion or interference. 10 feet away, then 5, then close enough to reach out and touch it. I extended my hand. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood with that perfect stillness that suggested existence beyond normal temporal flow. My fingers made contact with what should have been its shoulder, and the sensation was wrong. Not solid flesh, but something else. Something that existed in more dimensions than I could properly perceive, like touching a three-dimensional shadow of a four-dimensional object. The moment of contact produced a cascade of perception that bypassed normal sensory processing. I saw, or perhaps understood, or perhaps simply experienced, the figure's history. A researcher, Dr. Amanda Porter, who'd worked at Crestfall in the early 1980s, who'd entered this same void space to document its contents, who'd approached a figure just as I was doing, made contact just as I had, and in that moment of touching had been pulled fully into the impossible geometry, losing connection with normal dimensional framework, becoming part of the space itself. And I understood that I was following the exact same path. That contact had initiated a process of topological integration that would pull me permanently into this void, unless I broke the connection immediately. I jerked my hand back and stumbled backward, away from the figure, away from the invitation to join it in this space between spaces. The voices of the extraction team were louder now, much closer, and I turned toward them, toward the door I'd entered through, and I ran. The void tried to hold me. I could feel it, not a physical grip but a geometric one, as if the space itself was curving around me, attempting to prevent my exit by making the distance to the door progressively longer even as I ran toward it. 10 steps became 20, became 50, the doorway remaining always at the same apparent distance despite my movement. But the void's hold wasn't absolute yet. The contact had been brief, the integration incomplete. I focused on the cognitive countermeasures Ramos had taught me, grounding myself in normal geometric relationships, insisting on Euclidean space where distance remained constant, where movement in a direction brought you closer to destinations in that direction. The doorway began to approach, slowly at first, then with gathering speed, until I was stumbling through it back into the stone corridor, back into space that operated under comprehensible physical principles. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, breathing hard, my heart hammering with a combination of exertion and terror. The voices of the extraction team were very close now, perhaps one corridor over, calling my name with increasing urgency. "Here," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "I'm here." Footsteps rapid and heavy, then 3 figures in tactical gear appearing at the corridor junction. They swept toward me with practiced efficiency, one of them checking me for injuries while another scanned the area with some kind of handheld device, and the third spoke into a radio. "We have him. Subject is ambulatory and responsive. Initiating extraction now." They guided me back through the corridors with a speed that suggested familiarity with the deep archive layout, up the stone stairwell with its 217 steps, through the wooden door into the 3rd floor, down the main stairwell to the 1st floor, and out into October daylight that felt like a physical shock after the underground darkness. An ambulance was waiting in the clearing, along with several unmarked vehicles. I was loaded into the ambulance despite my protests that I could walk, and we drove away from Crestfall with lights flashing but no sirens, following an escort vehicle back down the access road and onto state highways toward the Berkshire Falls facility. Dr. Ramos and Colonel Webb were waiting when we arrived. I was taken immediately to the medical examination room where I'd been assessed after my first visit, and the testing process began again. Cognitive function, spatial reasoning, temporal perception, memory assessment. The results were worse than before. My temporal perception had degraded significantly, my estimates now off by factors of 2 or 3. The spatial reasoning test showed even more pronounced distortions, with lines that I perceived as curved by 10 or 15 degrees from true, distances that varied by 20 or 30% from their actual measurements. "You were inside for 47 minutes, Ramos said when the testing was complete. 17 minutes past the safe extraction window, and you made physical contact with one of the figures in Deep Archive 3. That's never happened before. No one has touched one of those entities and returned." "What am I now?" I asked. "What did that contact do to me?" She exchanged a look with Webb before answering. "We're not entirely sure. The contact initiated a process of topological integration. Essentially, you began to be incorporated into the void space's geometric structure. But you broke the contact before the process completed. You exist now in a kind of intermediate state, partially integrated but not fully transformed." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning your perceptual architecture has been permanently altered," Webb said. "You'll continue to experience spatial and temporal distortions, likely with increasing severity. The compulsion to return to Crestfall will be overwhelming, probably irresistible within days or at most weeks. And when you do return, the integration process will resume from where it left off. You'll complete your transformation into one of those figures." I sat with this information, processing the reality that I'd effectively guaranteed my own eventual absorption into the Crestfall Archive's impossible geometries. "How long?" I asked. "Before the compulsion becomes irresistible. Based on previous cases with similar exposure levels, probably less than a week. Could be as soon as 2 or 3 days." "And you can't prevent it? Can't counteract the integration somehow?" "We're going to try," Ramos said. "Intensive pharmaceutical intervention, cognitive behavioral techniques, physical isolation if necessary. But Dr. Vaughn, you need to understand, no one with your level of exposure has ever successfully resisted long-term. The best we can hope for is to extend the timeline, to give you as much normal time as possible before the inevitable." "How much time are we talking about? Days? Weeks?" "Days," she said quietly. "Maybe a week if the interventions are unusually effective, but not longer than that." They kept me at the facility under observation, in a small room with a bed and a chair, and a window that looked out on the chain-link fence and the forest beyond. I was given medication every 4 hours, increased dosages of the experimental compounds, plus additional drugs meant to stabilize neuroplasticity and resist topological distortion. The first day was manageable. The compulsion was present but bearable, a constant low-level pull that I could resist through conscious effort and the cognitive countermeasures. The perceptual distortions were noticeable but not debilitating. I could function, could read, could hold conversations with Ramos and Webb during their frequent check-ins. The second day was significantly worse. The compulsion had intensified to the point where it occupied most of my conscious attention, requiring continuous active resistance to prevent myself from simply walking out of the facility and driving back to Crestfall. The perceptual distortions had progressed. The room's corners didn't quite meet at right angles. The distance to the door seemed to vary depending on my position. Time moved in fits and starts with minutes passing like hours and hours passing like minutes. By the third day, I could barely maintain coherent thought. The compulsion had become a physical pressure, a gravitational pull toward the northwest that I could feel in my bones, in my neural architecture, in the fundamental geometry of my consciousness. The room had become almost impossible to navigate. Walls curved when they should have been straight. The floor's topology shifted with each step. Familiar objects existed in locations they couldn't occupy. Ramos visited that evening, accompanied by a man I hadn't met before, elderly, perhaps 80, with careful eyes and the deliberate movements of someone managing chronic pain. "Dr. Vaughn, this is Dr. Herman Walcott," she said, "the architect who designed Crestfall." I tried to focus on him, but my eyes kept sliding away, unable to maintain stable visual processing. "You created it," I managed. "The impossible spaces." "I created the mathematical framework," he said, his voice raspy with age. "The building created itself, or perhaps it was always there in some abstract topological sense, and I simply provided the physical anchor that allowed it to manifest in our dimensional framework." He sat carefully in the chair beside my bed. "I've been where you are now, Dr. Vaughn. I touched one of those figures in 1986, during the final months before we sealed the facility. I broke contact, just as you did. I've been living with the integration ever since." "You've resisted for 19 years, I said, the words requiring enormous effort to form coherently. "How?" "Not resisted, managed. There's a difference." He held up his hands, and I saw they were shaking with a fine tremor. "I returned to Crestfall once a month. Controlled visits, never longer than 15 minutes, never penetrating deeper than the first basement corridor. Just enough exposure to satisfy the compulsion temporarily, to reset the countdown before it becomes overwhelming." "That's possible. Partial exposure that doesn't lead to full integration. For those of us in intermediate states, yes. We exist in a kind of equilibrium, partially integrated with Crestfall's topology, but not so completely that we lose connection with normal space. Monthly visits maintain that equilibrium, prevent the compulsion from escalating to irresistible levels while also preventing further integration." I tried to process this, but coherent thought was becoming increasingly difficult. "You're offering me the same arrangement." "I'm offering you a way to survive," Walcott said. "It's not a cure. You'll never be free of Crestfall, never fully recover normal perception. But you can maintain a functional existence, can have years or even decades of quasi-normal life punctuated by monthly visits to manage the compulsion." "What's the alternative?" "You return to Crestfall within the next day or two, penetrate back into the deep archive 3 sections, and complete your integration into those void spaces. You become one of those figures, standing motionless in impossible geometries, existing but not living, present but not conscious in any way we understand." The choice was obvious, but I needed to understand the implications. These monthly visits, what do they involve? What do I have to do? "Enter the building, descend to the first basement corridor. Spend approximately 10 to 15 minutes in that space. The exposure is sufficient to temporarily satisfy the compulsion without furthering the integration process. Then leave immediately. Return to normal life until the next month when the cycle repeats. And this works indefinitely. It's worked for me for 19 years. I maintain a consulting practice, have a reasonably normal life between visits. The perceptual distortions are permanent but stable. I've learned to compensate for them, to function despite seeing the world through slightly wrong geometry. It's not ideal, but it's survival. Ramos stepped forward. We've developed protocols for this, Dr. Vaughn. Scheduled monthly visits under medical supervision, extraction teams standing by, strict time limits enforced. It's a management approach rather than a cure, but it's the best option available for individuals with your level of exposure. I wanted to ask more questions, wanted to fully understand what I was committing to, but the compulsion was intensifying to the point where conscious thought was becoming nearly impossible. The pull toward Crestfall was overwhelming, demanding immediate action, insisting that I needed to return now, needed to complete the survey, needed to rejoin the building that had claimed me. Yes, I managed. Yes, I'll do it, the monthly visits, whatever it takes. We need to do the first one immediately, Walcott said. Your compulsion level is approaching critical threshold. Another few hours and it will be too late. You'll attempt to reach Crestfall on your own, without supervision, without the discipline to limit exposure time. They transported me that night, in an ambulance with Webb and a full extraction team following in escort vehicles. The drive through dark October landscape took 90 minutes that felt like both seconds and years. Temporal perception so distorted that I couldn't track the passage of time at all. The Crestfall archive appeared in the headlights, ageless and wrong, waiting with what felt like anticipation for my return. I was guided inside by the extraction team, their hands on my arms providing physical grounding as we descended to the basement corridor. The cold hit like a physical blow, and the wrongness of the space crashed over me with overwhelming force. But underneath the disorientation and distortion, I felt something else, relief, a sense of homecoming, of returning to a space that had become necessary for my continued existence. We stood in that corridor for exactly 12 minutes by Webb's count, though my perception suggested anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 hours. Then the extraction team guided me firmly back to the surface, back to the ambulance, back to the facility in Berkshire Falls. The relief was immediate and dramatic. Within an hour of leaving Crestfall, the compulsion had diminished to manageable levels. The perceptual distortions remained, but the urgent need to return, the overwhelming pull that had dominated my consciousness for 3 days, had subsided to a background pressure. This is how it works, Walcott explained during a debriefing the following morning. The monthly visit resets the compulsion, allows you to function normally, or as normally as possible given the permanent perceptual changes. You'll feel a gradual increase in the pull as the month progresses, but it remains manageable until about day 25 or 26. Then you schedule the next visit, repeat the cycle. For the rest of my life. Yes, I'm sorry, Dr. Vaughn, but this is survival. This is how those of us who touch the deep spaces continue to exist in the world. I returned to Providence 2 days later, carrying prescriptions for medications that helped stabilize spatial perception, contact information for Ramos and Webb, and a schedule card showing my next Crestfall visit tentatively marked for 4 weeks hence. My apartment felt wrong. The angles weren't quite right. The distances between objects seemed to shift. The geometry of familiar space had become subtly alien. But I could function, could eat, could sleep, could attempt to resume some semblance of normal life. I couldn't return to architectural documentation work. My perceptual distortions made accurate surveying impossible. Instead, I found work teaching at a small college introductory architecture courses where my warped perception was less critical, where I could talk about design principles and historical precedents without needing to measure spaces or draft plans. The students never knew that when I looked at the classroom, I saw walls that curved slightly, corners that didn't quite meet properly, distances that varied depending on my position. I learned to compensate, to navigate through space that behaved wrongly, to function despite seeing the world through broken geometry. The first month passed slowly. The compulsion was present but manageable, a low-level awareness of Crestfall's location to the northwest, a subtle pull that could be ignored through conscious effort. I took the medications, practiced the cognitive countermeasures, checked in weekly with Ramos to report stable condition. On day 26, the compulsion intensified dramatically. The pull became a pressure, an urgent need to return, to descend into those cold corridors, to stand in spaces where geometry operated under non-standard principles. I drove to Berkshire Falls that evening, met the extraction team, and was transported to Crestfall for my second managed visit. 12 minutes in the basement corridor. 12 minutes of wrongness and cold and that strange relief of being in a space that had become necessary. Then extraction, return, reset. The cycle established itself over the following months. 4 weeks of quasi-normal function, gradually increasing compulsion, then a managed visit that reset the countdown. Each month I spent 12 minutes in Crestfall's basement, standing in cold darkness, while the building's impossible topology pressed against my awareness, maintaining the equilibrium that allowed me to continue existing in both normal space and the archive's distorted geometries. That was 17 months ago. I've made 17 managed visits to Crestfall, stood in those corridors for a cumulative total of approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. The perceptual distortions have neither improved nor worsened significantly. I still see space through broken geometry, still experience time as inconsistent and unreliable, but I function. I teach my classes, maintain my apartment, have occasional interactions with colleagues who don't know that I'm perceiving them through a fundamental wrongness in spatial relationships. I know this arrangement will continue for the rest of my life. That once a month, every month, until I die or until something changes with Crestfall's topology, I'll make this pilgrimage to impossible spaces. That I'm tethered permanently to that building in its forest clearing, connected by geometric bonds that can be managed but never broken. And I know that I'm not alone. Walcott makes his monthly visits on a different schedule. Ramos has mentioned others, 6 individuals currently in managed equilibrium states, each making monthly returns to Crestfall to satisfy the compulsion, to maintain the balance between normal existence and topological integration. We're satellites of that building, orbiting its wrongness, pulled by gravitational forces that operate through dimensional frameworks rather than physical mass. We exist in both worlds simultaneously, present in normal space but connected to impossible geometries, functional in conventional reality but fundamentally altered by exposure to spaces that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, during my managed visits, I glimpse the figures in the deeper sections. Through open doors, down distant corridors standing motionless in their void spaces. I recognize Amanda Porter now, can identify her among the others by the clothing she wears, the posture she maintains. I wonder if she's aware in some way, if consciousness persists in that transformed state, or if she exists in a kind of eternal stasis, present but empty, a geometric artifact rather than a person. I wonder if that will be me eventually, if the managed equilibrium will fail, if the compulsion will someday intensify beyond control, if I'll make one final visit to Crestfall and penetrate too deep, and complete the integration process that I interrupted when I jerked my hand away from contact. But for now, I survive. I teach my classes and take my medications and practice my cognitive countermeasures, and once a month I return to the building that has claimed me, stand in its cold corridors for 12 minutes, and then leave again to resume my fractured existence in normal space. The Crestfall archive sits in its clearing, patient and wrong, containing more space than it should, calling to those susceptible to its pull, growing slowly in dimensions we can't properly measure or comprehend. It was built to store documents. It became something else, something that exists partially in our dimensional framework, and partially in configurations we lack the cognitive architecture to fully perceive. And it's still there, still waiting, still growing. The deep archive sections extend farther with each visit, new corridors branching off from familiar passages, new rooms appearing in locations that previously held only wall. The building is expanding, developing, pursuing whatever purpose emerges from its impossible topology. Someday, perhaps, it will grow large enough or complex enough to escape the containment of its physical location, to extend beyond the clearing, beyond the forest, to begin incorporating more of normal space into its distorted geometries. Webb and Ramos worry about this possibility, monitor the building's perimeter for signs of external expansion, maintain contingency plans for scenarios they won't fully describe. But for now, it remains contained, isolated in its clearing, accessible only by a single access road, known only to those of us who have been claimed by it, and those who study it and attempt to prevent others from being similarly claimed. I don't know how this ends. Don't know if I'll maintain equilibrium until natural death, or if I'll eventually join Amanda Porter and the others in their void spaces, or if some intervention or breakthrough will someday break the connection and restore normal perception. What I know is that the Crestfall archive contains more than documents, more than the evidence and materials that were deposited there during its years of operation. It contains pieces of everyone who has penetrated too deeply into its impossible spaces, fragments of consciousness, geometric imprints of awareness, portions of identity that were incorporated into its topology and can never be fully extracted. I am partially incorporated, partially transformed, existing in the boundary between normal space and wrongness, managing the equilibrium that allows me to maintain presence in both. And once a month, when the compulsion builds to critical levels, I return to that building in its clearing, descend into cold corridors that extend beyond physical possibility, and stand for 12 minutes in spaces that are claiming me slowly, incrementally, month by month. The building is patient, and it's still waiting in its wrongness for the day when I or Walcott or one of the others finally stays too long, penetrates too deep, completes the integration that we've been managing and postponing and delaying. It will happen eventually. The equilibrium cannot hold indefinitely. But until then, I survive in this fractured state, teaching students who see classrooms with proper angles while I see geometry that curves wrong, living in an apartment where distances shift and time moves inconsistently, returning monthly to the place that broke me and continues to claim me. My name is Dr. Elias Vaughn, and 17 months ago, I believed that the worst thing about working in institutional preservation was the dust. I was wrong. The worst thing about preservation work is discovering that some spaces preserve more than documents. They preserve the people who enter them, incorporating consciousness into topology, transforming awareness into geometry, claiming pieces of identity and integrating them into impossible architectures. And once you've been claimed, once you've touched the deep spaces and broken contact just before full integration, you exist forever in that boundary state, present in normal reality, but connected to wrongness, functional in conventional space, but fundamentally altered by exposure to dimensions that human perception was never meant to process. The Crestfall archive is still there, still growing, still calling. And I'll return next month, and the month after, and every month until the equilibrium fails or I complete my transformation or something changes in the topology of that impossible place. Because I have no choice, because the building has claimed me, because I exist now in both worlds simultaneously, and monthly visits are the price of maintaining that fractured existence. The survey was never completed. The documentation remains unfinished, and in some geometric sense that bypasses normal causality, it always will be, because the spaces I was sent to document are still expanding, still developing, still creating new rooms and corridors and void spaces that would require documentation if anyone were foolish enough or compelled enough to attempt it. But no one will, because everyone who's entered deeply enough has either been claimed entirely or exists now as I do, managing equilibrium, making monthly pilgrimages, surviving in the boundary between possible and impossible. The building sits in its clearing, patient in its wrongness, waiting. And I am waiting too, in my own way, for whatever comes next.